Good evening. My name is Heather Coriel, and I'm pleased to welcome all of you to tonight's event. This is the second conference in a year-long series entitled Confronting Underdevelopment, Voices for Change. And tonight's conference and tomorrow's workshops are co-sponsored by the Harvard-Radcliffe International Development Forum and the Student Council from the Center for International Affairs. The two-day symposium, which begins this evening, is entitled Multinational Corporations and International Development. And in tonight's conference, we're interested in looking at the question, what role can multinational corporations play in the developing strategies of developing countries? And we've assembled quite a panel for you this evening, and tonight's moderator, as in all the sessions, will be Professor Timmer, the John D. Black Professor of Business and Agriculture at the Business School. And it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Timmer.
Thank you all for coming. I really wanted Heather to have an opening word to say because she and her colleagues at the International Development Forum have done most of the work in organizing this symposium. It has been a great deal of work. She has put together, I think, a very interesting panel. I think we have a hot topic tonight. We also, with 4 speakers, have a limited amount of time for each speaker to put their views before the floor. Last time, when we were talking about what is development, we had more questions from the floor than we could deal with from the panel, and I suspect the same thing is true tonight. So I have asked our speakers to try to get their opening comments in 15 minutes. All of us understand that 15 minutes isn't very long. In the hopes that we will have some time for interchange among the panelists immediately after their formal presentation, and then still have substantial amount of time for interaction with the audience. I've asked our speakers tonight to be provocative. They'll have to be if they're going to be brief, but not to lead to any violence. I hope that the discussion will start off by moving beyond whether it's all right to make a profit in the development process. The issue is within the context of that, it's all right. What will be the role of multinational corporations? How do we encourage the positive elements that multinational corporations might be able to bring to the development process? And how do we discourage or regulate any negative aspects that may come with, if you like, the baggage? Tonight we have 4 different perspectives on that question. Our first speaker, I'll introduce them as they speak. Our first speaker tonight is Larry Franco, who we discovered tonight. He and I are classmates, class of '63, both economics majors in the college. He is professor of international business relations, director of the program in international business relations at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts. He's director of the Center for International Competitive Analysis at Tufts. He's worked in a number of developing countries, including Tunisia, Algeria, and Venezuela. He is an expert on the role of European, Japanese, and United States multinationals, having done books on each of those, as well as a book on developing country debt. His perspective comes from his academic training background and perspective at Tufts as a professor, but also comes from extensive involvement in the developing countries themselves. So this is not a U.S. academic perspective on the role of multinationals. It's a much broader perspective than that, as we will find from all 4 of our speakers. These perspectives coming from a diverse number of points of view. I'll ask Larry to start our discussion then with his title, The Role of Multinationals, Market Rediscovered.
4 years ago, I was living in Geneva, Switzerland, where I spent about a dozen years or so, home of a number of institutions concerned with economics and development economics in particular. and I found myself coordinating a task force for the International Labor Organization on multinationals and employment in developed economies and in less developed economies. We waded through many facts, many books, many articles, many interviews, and we came up with some rather simple conclusions, one of which was the perhaps obvious observation that follows, but it bear repeating and emphasizing. If one looked at the wealthiest advanced industrialized countries, Switzerland, Sweden, the United States, Netherlands, one found countries with lots of their own multinational corporations, or who were spawning lots of their own multinational corporations at a very rapid rate, like Germany and Japan. If one looked at middle-level industrial countries like Belgium, Canada, the United Kingdom, and Italy, one found countries that had lots of other people's multinational companies implanted in those countries. If one looked at the rapidly advancing, newly industrializing countries, or transitional countries as the World Bank sometimes refers to some of them, like Ireland, Spain, Taiwan, Singapore, Korea, and Hong Kong, also found lots of other people's multinational companies. When one looked at the less developed countries, euphemistically called sometimes, one found neither their own multinational corporations, few, and in some cases, hardly any, of any ones. Correlation is not causation, but it is interesting to reflect on this fact. Part of the reason for which pattern was due to a conscious on the part of many less developed countries. LDs during the 1960s and 1970s, in many cases, particularly in Latin America and Africa, limited or rejected foreign equity investment. A bit tenor of the times, it may be purely accidental, but teaching a seminar on country risk analysis lately, and we've been using the International Monetary Fund international statistics, and we were amused to discover that the line in the balance of payments data for private capital is line 77 BAD, bad. Well, that may be purely accidental on the part of the IMF, but that gives you a little bit of what the tenor of the times was. For that matter, a lot of these Latin American and African countries not only rejected or limited foreign equity, they rejected or limited domestic equity investments as well, and put large chunks of their domestic economies in state hands. Pemex in Mexico, YPF in Argentina in the oil business, many developing countries, less developed countries, nationalized their banking system, and many of them had parastatals supposedly developing their industrial base. Interestingly enough, it was the same less developed countries that rejected or severely restricted foreign equity who relied most on debt. And we now speak of developing countries, at least in Latin America and Africa, in the same breath as we speak of a debt crisis. I think people tend to forget the intellectual background to how the LDCs got into so much debt, and how they got thrown onto the tender or not so tender mercies of the Paris and London clubs and the IMF. 1960, 1970 were the decades of, quote, development economics, unquote. Part of the theorizing of development economics during that time concerned an idea which came to be called unbundling. It was a positive rationale for limiting the role of foreign equity of foreign multinationals in developed countries. Basically, it started out with the notion that foreign companies were bad, foreign equity was bad, because there was created a permanent or quasi-permanent claim on these on the host countries in the form of dividends. Wasn't it ever so much cheaper, so said, to undertake debt, which you would repay back 5 or 6 years? It seemed cheap at the time, interest rates being at the relatively low. And then, of course, after 5 or 6 years and paying back debt, especially if there was inflation, it would be even cheaper in real terms. You'd own it, you'd control it, you wouldn't have to have these multinationals around. It, of course, tended to, this argument overlooked the fact that dividends were payable only if there was a return, an economic return, and after host country taxes. But it was part of this reason why countries like Morocco, another country I had spent some time in, decided that they would build phosphate fertilizer plants. Their government would borrow, finance those phosphate fertilizer plants, and that this was somehow rather better than multinationals. The negative rationale for rejecting or controlling foreign multinationals was fear of control. It wasn't always clear what exactly the fear consisted of control, but in part it was fear of many monopolies. If one looks at the Marxist or quasi-Marxist literature or listens to people, particularly in French or speaking countries, often one gets the impression that many of these multinationals are considered monopolies. Well, this is partly true, but not really, because one observes very few, if any, multinationals these days who are monopolies in their sectors. One observes oligopolies. But oligopoly is a hard word to say. My secretary once mistyped it as oilgopolies, which at the time seemed appropriate enough. But oligopolies are not the same thing as monopolies. There are already many players in the game. And further, this fear of control occurred often without the recognition that a lot of these oligopolies, and in particular the oilgopoly, fragmenting at an extraordinarily rapid rate. Everybody knows about the Seven Sisters, but that was back in the 1950s. By 1970, there were at least 300 multinational companies, many of whom were never American. They were European or Japanese, or in a few cases, developing countries, who were undertaking oil production and exploration around the world. The monopoly, it turned out later, after much bitter experience, would not the multinational producing companies, or even the multinational extractive companies, or even the multinational plantation and agribusiness companies, the real monopoly, the Paris Club, and the IMF. A lot of this unbundling philosophy and rejection of multinationals was combined with some other policies which tended to be associated with one another. Not always explicitly on a rejection of multinationals, but it amounted to the same thing. These policies were typically combined with statist, inward-looking, quote, development policies, public state-owned companies. Parenthetically, this meant that there were very few really interesting opportunities for a lot of domestic equity investment as well. Where were domestic persons who were accumulating capital going to invest their money if the best opportunities were preempted by parastatals? The policies were import substitution policies, oriented toward the domestic economy, toward substituting for it's not for promoting for exports in many cases. These were typically combined with valued exchange rates. Exchange rates which had the effect, which did not compensate for often much more rapid domestic inflation relative to international inflation levels, with the effect of raising the costs of local companies so that they could not export to world markets. The overvalued exchange rates had the effect of encouraging imports, and they had the effect of making promotional flight. If the dollar is the cheapest pound, people will buy dollars. They will not keep in pesos or whatever. Typically, these statist centralized economies had everywhere no competition, not competitive markets, permit markets, and bureaucrats everywhere. When foreign investment was sometimes allowed, it was usually allowed only joint venture partners, sometimes state joint venture partners, big bureaucrats or big bureaucracies, often sometimes local private joint venture partners, who tended to be sort of Mr. Big's local economy, who were often passive joint venture partners, not active joint venture partners in the running of the enterprises where the multinational times permitted. There were some results, many results, to these combinations of policy. The debt burden, because developing countries did not seem to appreciate private business person sooner or later appreciates. In fact, what any owner of a home mortgage appreciates, and that is debt business means risk. You are obligated to pay those interest payments. It's not the same thing as your own money in an enterprise or an enterprise not interest payments, but paying dividend and if there are profits. There were certain other results. Some of them involved ethical dilemmas for multinationals. One of the ethical dilemmas for multinationals concerns precisely the policy of occasional entry through joint ventures. These joint venture partners are frequently rentiers. They are not active observers, active participants in technology. From the country point of view, that's the technology is not absorbed as well as it might be. There are income distribution effects which are very negative. Unfortunately, in Latin America, one finds many people passively collecting dividends from the occasional joint ventures, and the income distribution effects are clear because one of their purposes is, in effect, to act as tax farmers. They collect monopoly rents of a protected enterprise in a protected market. Does not go to the state. That does not necessarily go to the government. A private individual who is put in as a partner. This policy can distract or, at the worst, eliminate drive for entrepreneurship, and perhaps worst of all, it creates local vested interests for protection. If tariff protection, if trade protection, if import permits were to be abolished, these people would be out their incomes. It's battles between multinationals and governments over the appropriation of monopoly rents of protection. Many of the transfer pricing disputes between nationals and host countries arguably would have been there if it were not for monopoly rents that had been created by markets, which encouraged the multinationals to try to find some transfer pricing means of getting the rent outside of the country. The permit economies also put multinationals in another dilemma, ethical dilemma, which has to do with bribes and people often talk about the effects of the practices of multinationals and worry about multinationals corrupting people in local economies. Well, sometimes the old phrase, it takes two to tango. There is the corruptor and the corruptee, and it's often not clear who is the corruptor and who is the corruptee. What seems to strike me is that even in domestic bribery and corruption, isn't it interesting how the incidence seems to rise when one has a government gatekeeper providing access to in effect, a monopsonistic market where there is one purchaser. And then you put the company bidders on the other side, and it is all too tempting for somebody to solicit or one of the companies to offer a little something extra to get the contract. Some other effects have followed from these policies, particularly the policy of discouraging, in effect, entrepreneurship, discouraging exports, not using multinationals for what the Asian countries have discovered the multinationals often do best, and that is to provide access to foreign markets. One of the real needs, I think, in the debate about multinationals in developing countries is to, if I may draw an analogy, to something out in Asia, stop asking the Zen Buddhist question. The Zen Buddhist question, you remember the most famous one, is what is the sound of one hand clapping? Well, me, I'm often struck by the debate of what do multinationals do to countries is a little bit like asking the question, what is the sound of one hand clapping? What about the other hand? What about the policies of the developing or less developed countries themselves? I think we need to reconsider those, and I think there is a move on the part of many less developed countries to reconsider those. Very interestingly enough, perhaps the country that has gone the farthest to reconsider those is not a country we usually consider lump in the developing world because it is or was or is still semi-communist. It is the People's Republic of China. It is important, I think, because whatever the case was 20 years ago for saying that some multinationals could hold hostage or dominate some countries, I think it even verges on being patronizing to say that governments cannot set policies to use multinationals constructively in constructive development policies and are somehow rather helpless. We've seen OPEC and the oil revolution. The oil multinationals are not powerful anymore. Many countries have successfully implemented programs of indigenization of management. They've renegotiated concessions. They've even gone to the extreme of performance requirements, in effect holding multinationals hostage. In other words, if you, automobile, Volkswagen or Ford, want to stay profitable in Brazil, you had better export. And countries are not too hesitant to do this sort of thing. The conclusion, I think that the multinational debate ought to take seconds to debates about how developing countries can get other people's multinational enterprises. And if one needs a counterweight, a countervailing power, and one does. I would be first to admit that in many cases. Do it not by legal controls, not by creating permits, not by bureaucrats, not by corrupting and corrupted gatekeepers, but by developing entrepreneurship, promoting equity investment, not only or maybe not even mainly foreign, but domestic equity investment. If Latin American private investors had been able to invest in Pemex or YPF, would they now need today to be holding approximately the equivalent of their Mexican and Argentinian debt in U.S. real estate? I wonder. One needs to think about policies to promote research and development, to promote exports, and to promote competition. Japan, Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, and increasingly Malaysia have been doing those things. The People's Republic of China has been doing those things. We see success in Asia. We see very doubtful economies and policies in much of Latin America and Africa. Peter mentioned that we were classmates in 1963. I studied with a gentleman who was a professor here at the time by the name of Gottfried Habler. He gave a famous and widely attacked speech in 1956 at the National Bank of Cairo, in which he argued that he was unhappy with the tendency of economics to split into development economics versus regular economics. He says there ought two kinds of economics. There's economics, there's good economics, and there's bad economics, not developed country economics and less developed country economics. I think the weight of history has shown that he was right.
Thank you very much, Larry. Marissa, you are from Mexico.
I'm a Spaniard originally, but I come from Mexico now.
I hear several themes that we will pursue further this evening, but which will also be pursued in considerable depth in several of the workshops tomorrow. I think particularly of the one that Larry raises, the role of the multinational corporation, China's future development, a topic for one of the workshops that will be held tomorrow. I'll tell you a little bit more about those at the end, but I couldn't resist plugging that one given the obvious entree. Our next speaker is Marisol Martin, originally a Spaniard, but from Mexico, a lawyer, was Master of Arts, Master in Law from Harvard, specialized originally in family law. Specialist also, she says, in French literature, number of books written on family affairs, came back to Cambridge interested in scientific technology with respect to family planning, got interested in Latin America again, and is now a doctoral candidate in political science at MIT. We will hear from her, obviously, a different perspective on the role of the multinational corporation in the development process, but also looking at what can be done and what our fears might be.
Thank you, Professor Timmer. Obviously, like you say, I will speak with a different voice. Several months ago, there was an excellent series of television programs on China. These programs had been filmed over a period of 2 years by a team of American and British experts. At the end of the episode, which portrayed the hard but balanced life at the farm, the commentators' closing remarks were as follows. Certainly, China has put up an admirable effort to reach its present stage of development. Is there any way we can help them? Many ways. For instance, we should spur their consumption of pork. Chinese diet is rather scarce, and so it should become a priority that their diet is enriched by products they like but cannot afford. How is that? It's obvious that it's cheaper for the people to eat grains than to spend them in feeding pigs. How then are they going to pay for the luxury of pork? Oh, we will, in America, produce the grains to satisfy the extra demand pig raising presents, and at the same time we will set out some industries which would provide the Chinese with the foreign exchange they need to pay for our grains. At this point, I could not help saying to myself, and forgive me if I sound disrespectful, here they go again. So when I read the question proposed for tonight's session, what roles can multinational corporations play in developing countries, I was not even surprised, but rather somewhat puzzled by the implicit assumptions the phrasing of the question allows us to formulate. In effect, To my understanding, the question posed for today implies a number of important issues, out of which I chose two major ones to focus on tonight. The discussion of these issues will, in turn, allow me to propose what role multinational corporations should play in the countries. The two assumptions I'm going to concentrate on are, one, that multinational corporations possess a decision-making power in the political discourse in their host countries, and two, that there is a certain willingness in multinational corporations to suit the best interest of their host countries. First, then, where does the conflict reside, if at all, between the political decision-making power of a multinational corporation and its host state? The conflict resides on the impingement of the state's sovereignty, in the threat the multinational corporation decision-making power poses to the sovereignty of the host state. Let me mention, just in passing, that I am aware of the neglect the theory of the state has experienced over a number of decades in this country. Nonetheless, since the mid-70s, there seems to be a re-emergence of a consciousness towards the concept of state. Its definition or redefinition poses a stimulating intellectual challenge to scholars. Perhaps it is germane to this new interest the fact that the United States is itself becoming a stronger nation-state. However, polemics apart, for the purpose of the present argument, my position and conviction is that we are still a long way from the disappearance of the so-called traditional state, so the issues discussed will be framed accordingly. Sovereignty is an essential attribute of political power. Sovereign power is the highest or supreme and also, and more importantly, independent. This characteristic of independence reveals itself mainly in international relations. Sovereign states can by themselves, within the limits created or recognized by them, freely establish the content of their own competence. Sovereignty allows a state to auto-determine its goals and purposes. It is a formal concept. It does not deal with the substance of this political power. It merely expresses the supreme and independent character of it. If we therefore argue that the essential characteristic of the state consists in the ability to organize itself according to its own right or laws, it follows that when a group is organized according to a norm which springs from a foreign power, it is possible to attribute to it the nature of an indigenous group, even though it operates within the boundaries of the national territory. In other words, a multinational corporation should function within a foreign state only if it subjects itself to the foreign state's law and regulations. Multinational corporations acknowledge this existing problem, but they claim, as Undersecretary Ball explains, quote, that the multinational corporation represents a modern concept designed to meet the requirements of a modern age, while the nation-state is a very old idea, unquote. Multinational corporations are world-oriented, as nations are, except that they shift to the market in lieu of the nation, the key political dimension. The Council of the Americas, the voluntary political association created by David Rockefeller to represent 200 American corporations with businesses in Latin America, provides us with further evidence. This organization submitted a memorandum on July 26 of 1971 to its corporate members with the recommendation that, quote, it might be appropriate to mention in the articles, speeches, house organs, and everyday conversations the following slogan: consumer democracy is considerably more intelligent than political democracy, unquote. In other words, the market, not the regime or the state, is the key political reference. As Peter F. Dutcher, corporation ideologist, states in a caustic but graphic remark, quote, Latin America is not underdeveloped. It is just undermanaged. The multinational corporation's capacity to make commanding macro decisions transforms them automatically into de facto political actors of consequence. Their importance is felt more fully in the developing countries where they display the ability to set parameters for economic decisions. For this very reason, they place themselves as rivals of the state at this level of decision-making. The multinational corporation, like the nation-state, is not an abstract construct but a historical reality. Each is shaped by a set of specific social relationships, and each is presently constituted is a product of a given structure of domination. Both are hierarchies of domination, but the foreign corporation, to the extent their identity is evidenced and as long as the nation state survives, cannot have their overpresence in these countries politically legitimized. In spite of their formidable economic power, they are politically vulnerable in one context if they get involved in an overt conflict with the state. The General Assembly of the Organization of American States approved in Washington on July of 1978 a code of conduct for multinational corporations based on the Calvo Clause. The code was approved by 20 votes in favor, 4 against, and the abstention of the United States, who objected mainly to the validity of exclusive jurisdiction of the host country. Presently, domestic conditions in the United States and exogenous conditions in the international arena make the compliance with the 1978 code more viable. The document certainly provides for the peaceful and lawful resolution of conflicts and elucidates the area of competence of the economic and political powers. If multinational corporations understand that this important international instrument is conceived to protect the best interests of all parties, they will restrain themselves to their proper area of activity, the economic one. The crucial friction arising from the challenge to the sovereign power of Latin American states neutralized, all participants would come to the negotiating table with clear minds and reasonable perspectives. And now I pass to my second assumption, that there is a certain willingness in multinational corporations to suit the best interest of the host countries. Why this softening when we just explained that multinational corporations see their host countries as having neither a history and a political will, nor a society with a given culture and political institutions, but as a market? Several factors, domestic and internal, contribute to this new attitude. On the domestic scene, we can mention, first, powerful divergent interests now expressing themselves in American society, which compel the government to defend internal markets and level of employment. This defense is to be implemented through restrictions on movement of American capital and technology, higher taxation on firms and executives' incomes earned abroad, and through trade protectionist measures. Just yesterday, we read in the paper the Senate's approval of imposing quotas on imports of textiles and clothing from 12 countries and on leather shoes from all exporters. Second, it's a changing policy on foreign aid. Originally, the purpose of foreign aid in Latin America, according to the Senate testimony of a director of the Agency for International Development, is to promote, quote, the national interests of the United States. Such policy pursues to maintain a government or society consistent with the security interests of the United States in the hemisphere, and second, the protection and expansion of American economic interests, trade, and investment. In 1960, 41% of all commodities financed by aid were purchased in the United States as a result of what is called the tied aid provisions. The non-competitiveness of U.S. domestically produced goods in the world market, aggravated from the mid-60s on by Japanese and European expansion and by inflation and labor costs in the United States, increased the dependence of American domestic production on the aid given by foreign aid. A First National City Bank report on 1970 stated, for example, that without such aid, the United States commercial surplus could vanish. But the policy is changing. Senator Frank Church denounced on 1971, quote, "So we have pumped into Brazil $2 billion since 1962 to protect a favorable climate of investment that amounts to $1.6 billion, unquote. Senator Church's arithmetic approach is a clear indicator of a new concept. The United States' protection of private investment overseas is too expensive, even in the case of a country of such decisive importance for the United States' dominance in Latin America as Brazil. Shifts from traditional foreign aid policy to conform to the low profile adopted by the United States government give American investors the feeling of being on their own. This new state of affairs brings about a paradoxical situation. On one hand, United States labor unions strongly protest against American interests establishing runaway plans in lower wage countries. To defend capitalist domestic production, i.e. wages and jobs, the American working class is going more and more nationalistic, whereas to defend increasing profits and their share of the world market, important segments of American capitalists are going more and more internationalists or transnationalist. On the international scene, the picture does not look better for multinationals. I have already mentioned the increased availability and competitiveness of European and East Asian countries' products, but there is more. As back as 1969, 21 Latin American countries represented at the Villa del Mar conference protested the obligation to buy from domestic American firms imposed on the recipients of foreign aid regardless of cost. Apparently, President Nixon yielded to the demands and announced that beginning of November 1st, 1969, loans to Latin America under aid would be free to purchase anywhere in Latin America. In other words, the recipient countries would be free to purchase from American subsidiaries established in the region. Around this time, a new awareness, or maybe a sudden awareness, is perceived in Latin American countries, grasping perhaps for the first time their circumstance in the international concert of nations. They realize the chaotic state of their finances and the effects of massive and uncontrolled transference of technology and foreign investment. In this painful awakening, they also understood that development and underdevelopment are historical processes that come about in frames of concrete realities, that industrialized nations are not good paradigms to follow because the concrete historical circumstances which brought about the revolution are nowhere to be found in Latin America. Also, that Latin America is poor and may be worse. In this year of Professor Modigliani's Nobel Prize winning, Latin America has no savings. Together with the concern came the will to change. On the 30th of December of 1970, it was passed what is known as the 24th decision of the Cartagena Agreement. It proposed a common regime to deal with foreign capital, patents, marks, licensing agreements, and royalties. In particular, Article 20 forbids a number of clauses from being included in international contracts. Mainly, it forbids the obligation to buy capital goods, intermediate products, or raw materials from the purveyor of technology. It forbids the permanent use of personnel assigned by the purveyor of technology, the authorization to the purveyor of technology to fix the sale or resale prices of articles produced by the host enterprise, any conditions limiting the volumes of production, any condition forbidding the use of complementary technologies, any condition providing an option to buy to the supplier of the technology, the turning over of inventions or improvements made by the host enterprise, and clauses requiring payment for patents that are not used. In addition to these prohibitions, restrictions on exports of products were barred. These suggestions in time were reflected in the laws of foreign investment and technology transfer promulgated by each of the participating countries to the Cartagena Conference. The domestic and international events described above are some of the intervening factors in the apparent softened attitude of multinationals toward their host countries. To conclude, what role multinational corporations play in Latin America? From the point of view of the developing countries, multinational corporations represent the basic means to development if and when their activity corresponds to the goals set out by Latin American governments. From the point of view of multinational corporations, Latin America represents a market, maybe an ideal one. To the extent that corporations concentrate on their main sphere of competence, profit-making, and Latin American governments in safeguarding the principles, values, and patrimony of their respective states, a peaceful coexistence is entirely possible. Unfortunately, the fierce struggle that has been going on is played on different keys. Corporations believe themselves entitled to participate or activate political processes in their host countries. Host countries, resenting this intromission in their internal affairs, react violently. No one benefits from this situation. As difficult as it may seem, multinational corporations should abide by the laws of their host countries. This is called respect. Host countries should resist the temptation, read Carrot, that multinational corporations constantly present these poor countries and with reason and consistency implement the economic policies which, even though will not probably agree with the glamour of foreign projects and propositions, will in the long term account for a firm and steady economic growth and development. In short, if Latin America were China, it should do without pork.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Gerald West, whose job it is to convince the Chinese that they need pork. Actually, he is vice president of the development at the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, OPIC, which is a U.S. government organization with the goal of fostering private investment in developing countries, with the mandate that both the developing countries and the United States must benefit in the process. He joined OPIC in 1977, has held 4 other OPIC positions, including other than Vice President of Development. He served for 6 months as acting president of OPIC during the transition between administrations, and during that period he led the effort to secure the reauthorization of OPIC before Congress. Received his PhD in international politics from the University of Pennsylvania in 1973. For 9 years was affiliated with the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia and the Wharton School. He's currently adjunct professor in international business diplomacy at Georgetown University and indicates he would prefer to speak from his Georgetown chair than from the OPIC chair, simply because it will give him some more degrees of freedom. Gerald West.
Thank you very much. About 10 years ago, when I was solely in the professorial realm, I was very confident in talking about the subject of foreign investment. And I think at that time I had all the pseudo-arrogance and confidence that every good professor has, who has neatly used theory to classify reality into nice little bite-sized bunches. Since that time, unfortunately, I have grown far less confident in talking about foreign investment for a number of reasons. The biggest one is that I have operational responsibility for actually screening about 200 projects a year in terms of various statutory criteria within OPIC to make sure that they meet a number of criteria, most important of which is that the projects we assist contribute to the social and economic development of the countries in which they are located. There's a host of ancillary checks dealing with the environment, making sure that it doesn't harm the U.S. economy, etc. And I must tell you, from dealing with about 200 projects a year, that reality is very sobering, because it gets you into very awkward situations at times, especially when you have to testify before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee or the House Foreign Affairs Committee, which I've done about 12 times, and defend why, in development terms, you assisted a particular project. And you're treated to a situation where for 15 minutes you're personally castigated by a development economist for assisting a brazier project in Honduras, a project which, by the way, was total less than $500,000 altogether, the total investment, and our assistance probably was the equivalent of about $5,000 a year. And this development economist went on at great length on the misallocation of our resources, the misallocation of Honduras choosing to host such an investment, and it would be better for Honduran women to go braless rather than misallocate funds this way, etc. That was followed by a 15-minute diatribe from an AFL-CIO economist who, in the course of his presentation, mentioned that these braziers were probably coming back to the United States and harming U.S. IGLU workers who were not sewing bras together. There ensued a debate between Millicent Fenwick, who was irate that this development economist didn't think it was appropriate that women in Honduras wear braziers, and what difference was it to him if they were going to buy them anyway? Why not buy local produced braziers rather than external braziers? And then another congressman disagreed with her, and then you get an opportunity to come up there and defend this particular project. Well, let me assure you, when you go through that scores of times, you become a little less confident in your ability to arrogantly talk about foreign investment and the costs and the benefits of doing so. And I must say, I don't get too much solace from the work of academics and researchers who are contributing to this debate in terms of helping me out on my particular job. But you might say I'm a rather myopic bureaucratic wimp because I'm concerned with individual projects rather than seeing the big picture. So I'd ask if you would bear with me as I perhaps cover some more mundane topics than my more eloquent colleagues up here. But I'd like to say a few words about the costs and benefits associated with foreign investment, and then go on and share with you a little bit about how we attempt to screen investments in terms of the ones we choose to assist and the ones we choose to turn down, because it isn't all that easy to do. There's been a lot of empirical studies that suggest that, on balance, foreign private direct investment in the developing countries seems to contribute to the development process. But there's always those projects which seem to have a deleterious effect on the host country. I think it's true that an individual investment can have both positive and negative benefits to the country. Consider a case of an agribusiness project involving contract farming for export to the United States, let's say, fruits and vegetables in the off-season. It may do a great deal to enhance some farmers' incomes that are chosen to do this contract farming. There will be a great deal of rejected produce because we here in the United States, and for that matter in Europe, only want cosmetically perfect fruits and vegetables, so there's a great many seconds which can be sold on the local market. These, of course, increase the availability of foodstuffs and have certain nutrition value. On the other hand, they contribute to potentially driving down prices, thus depriving other subsistence farmers who are selling their produce of part of their income. Is this a good project or isn't it? I assure you, you can have a bunch of 5 or 6 economists chewing on that particular project for a year or two without being able to come up with a very decisive answer. I think the existence of this mix of positive and negative benefits associated from individual foreign investments is also reflected in some way in the attitudes developing countries have taken towards foreign investment. I think we saw a shift from the 1950s and 60s where there was a general predisposition to favor foreign investment in the developing countries, to a more nationalistic and negative view in the 70s, and in the 1980s, I would suggest, we're swinging back once again to viewing most foreign investment generally in a more favorable light. Now, certainly such changes in receptivity towards foreign investment in developing countries are brought about by many very interdependent and interrelated factors, including the behavior of multinational corporations, but also including the economic situation in those developing countries and the international economic situation. And let me mention a few of those situations that I think have a bearing. As Larry Franco mentioned, in the 1970s, we saw a large increase in the availability of private commercial debt financing. That led, I think, to a lessening on the part of many developing countries in their perceived need to try to attract foreign direct investment. This, I think, coupled with a number of years of dealing with multinationals, encouraged many developing countries to set up policies geared toward greater control of foreign investment. So we saw an era in which government boards were created to screen and register investment. We saw a great deal of Boston professors going out on consultantships to developing countries to help them develop these screening criteria. A great deal of money was devoted to develop very elaborate social cost benefit screening devices, which I might say were of questionable utility, at least in the eyes of the developing country regulators. You saw a great many performance requirements being put on investors. Limited profit remittances, local content requirements, local employment requirements, etc. Restrictions on keeping foreign equity in minority position, the exclusion of certain sectors from foreign investment completely. And many of these controls were established to give the host country greater influence not only on just what foreign investment took place, but the form and the manner in which they took place. But they also served to inhibit investment. If you look at the real annual growth of foreign direct investment from OECD countries in the 60s to developing countries, you saw that that growth was about 4.3% a year. When you looked at the 70s, that dropped below 1%. So one of the effects, I would submit, of these kinds of efforts was a reduction in the investment flow. The 1980s, of course, ushered in the debt crises. Commercial bank financing slowed, and suddenly the academic question of whether or not foreign investment could be empirically shown to be good or bad and how best to regulate it gave more way to a more broad realization that foreign investment can be harnessed to do things that contribute to whatever the development plan of the particular country was, the People's Republic of China, Panama, Chad, and so forth. The need for attracting foreign capital to fuel the kind of economic growth they wanted brought about quite a change, and that change is still going on now. Many countries are now not eliminating these restrictions, but streamlining their screening of foreign investment. This is reflected in efforts to try to more quickly come to a decision of whether to improve investments or to turn them down. There's a tendency towards keeping investment-inhibiting policies and procedures to a minimum. So you're seeing a great many tax changes taking place in developing countries now. You're seeing the birth of a whole wave of consultants going out from various American universities, helping countries set up in various kinds of investment incentives, tax holidays, free trade zones, and so forth. But investors, too, are changing their habits. They learned from the last decade. They're using direct investment more selectively. They're using other forms of investment where it's more appropriate or the national circumstances dictate. And I think both investors and host countries are giving more attention now to unbundling the package of assets associated with traditional foreign direct investment. Many firms, in particular small investors, are interested in forming joint ventures. They're looking into long-term licensing arrangements, technical assistance and management contracts that transfer a lot of very valuable and very wanted technology and know-how. This unbundling of the investment package has brought benefits to both investors and the host countries. And we see countries that have, for example, abundant management talent like India trying to seek licensing arrangements in joint ventures. We see countries that are known for high labor productivity going after, in particular, subcontracting arrangements that would make use of the investors' technology and greater managerial ability that they may lack. In short, there's been a great deal of adaptation on both the side of investors and on the side of developing countries. Let me turn to the very mundane topic of the difficulty of screening these investments if you happen to be burdened with a job, whether it's in the developing countries, in a multilateral aid agency, or in an agency as humble as the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, and some of the problems that you encounter. One of the things that you start out doing, at least we start out doing at OPIC, is that we don't want to assist any investment that the host government doesn't want. And we have a very simple procedure for doing that. We ask every single host government to approve every single project that we assist in writing. We want their approval before we grant any assistance, whether it's insurance or finance, to that investment. Second, we do not support a venture without assuring ourselves that the investment will produce beneficial development effects in the host country. We do our own economic analysis of that, and we look at a wide range of factors, including, for example, potential environmental impacts. We try to work with the investor, if it's possible to work with the investor, to resolve some of those problems, especially those dealing with environmental practices. We also spend a great deal of time, especially with small investors, trying to encourage them to form joint ventures for a number of reasons. in part because we think it reduces the political, non-commercial risks associated with those investments, and also we think it helps the U.S. firm overcome many of the managerial problems that they typically encounter in a developing country that could cause them to fail. I might digress here a second and say that you may have gotten the image, especially from the academic writings on multinational corporations, that they're all big oil companies or General Electric or General Motors and so on. About 40% of our clients are small investors, non-Fortune 1000 firms. You know, it's helping Hoyt Worthen out here in Haverhill, Massachusetts, who has the last kidskin tannery in the United States, find somewhere where he can get goat skins so he doesn't go out of business, and helping him set up an operation in Haiti to make use of the goat skins there. I might add those small investors tend to have the size of investments and serve the markets that exist in many of these small developing countries. And a great deal of attention, I would hope, in the future might be paid by the academic community to the role of these small investors in contributing to the development process. Now, I could give you a lot of examples of some of the problems we've encountered in screening projects in terms of some of the debates between economists and lawyers as to what constitutes a developmental project. But perhaps I can leave that to the question period. Let me give you one concluding note, and that is that OPIC is a very small agency. We're only about 130 people altogether. We're the second smallest federal agency in existence. And I might add, I'm not an example of your tax dollars at work. We happen to be completely self-sustaining. We have a minor Robin Hood role. We take money from multinational corporations for the privilege of writing them insurance and loaning money to them, and we live off the insurance premiums and the fees we charge them. And we actually make money. Unfortunately, we don't have a profit-sharing program, but we're working on that. Last year, our net income was about $100 million, and that would be nicely split between 140 of us. Generate employment for about 108,000 individuals. They will generate tax revenues paid to those developing country governments of about $1 billion. And they will provide net annual foreign exchange earnings of over $3 billion. Now, those aren't hypothetical numbers. We go out and monitor our projects after the fact to find out that they are doing what they allegedly estimated they would do, and we estimated they would do before we assisted them. And in some ways, that's a bit of empirical evidence, I think, with regard to the benefits that multinational investments can have in the development process. Let me stop on that note.
Thank you very much. Lots of room for questions coming up. Our last speaker is Ian Kinneborough from the Center on Transnational Corporations, the Policy Analysis and Research Division at the United Nations. Before his position there, he worked for the United Nations Development Program as officer for Bangladesh and the Regional Bureau for Asia and Pacific. He's trained in economics in England and in Australia, and brings to us the perspective of a multilateral agency that has had a long track record now in trying to come to grips with the abuses of the multinational investments as well as some of the potential. And he's bringing us the perspective then from the multilateral. Ian.
Thank you very much, Professor Timmer. There are some advantages in going last, but also some disadvantages in that some of the points I would have made have been very eloquently made, certainly far more eloquently made than I would do. Professor Timmer asked me before we started the title of my few words. I said I didn't have one. I now have. It's called Random Thoughts. Hopefully not too random. Just one brief word of explanation in case we have some language problems other than accent problems. We in the UN refer to something called transnational corporations, where everybody else refers to multinational corporations. There are various reasons for this, but of language and so on. But I think if you think about it, what are referred to as multinationals are in fact not multinational in any sense of the word. As we've heard, they're quite often they owe allegiance to their home country. So if I slip into the term transnational, excuse me. Now, I would agree with what Mr. West has said, that there's been a very distinct change in attitude over the last 10 or 15 years as far as multinationals are concerned. There were some specific events and some general feelings, I think possibly promoted not least by some Harvard professors, 10 or 15 years ago, which gave rise to, shall we say, some doubts about the merits of multinationals. One of the, if you like, the broad areas of concern was what was referred to by my colleague as that of nationality. There were questions about the interference of multinationals in the political affairs, the extent to which they dominated the economic life of countries, and in various senses threatened national sovereignty. And these concerns have been reduced over the last 10 or 15 years, I think in part for the reason identified here, but also because there is now greater knowledge and understanding of the process or what makes multinationals tick. The increased knowledge and understanding is, I think, operates on both sides. The developing countries, it's more, you're better to have the devil you know than the devil you don't, as it were. Some of and I would agree, there's advantages and disadvantages. If you recognize these, you can take them into account and make a qualified judgment of how you want to react. I think it was, again, 15 years ago, the fear of the unknown as much as anything else that prompted a lot, and Professor Franco has some other explanations, but a lot of the hostile reactions in the form of nationalism and so on and so forth. At the same time, the multinationals themselves have come to realize and recognize maybe not as much as we would all like, but certainly that they have broad social responsibilities in what we refer to as the host countries, in this sense, developing countries. There's recognition, again, it can be a positive sum game. That is, that the multinationals fit and the host country can also benefit from their operations within the... That's a subtle 2-minute warning, I presume.
Earlier than expected.
I see. I'll stop immediately. So I was saying that it can be a positive sum game. There can be advantages to both parties. The multinational can make profits in various ways, but at the same time there can be benefits to the developing countries, the host countries themselves. It can equally well, however, be a negative sum game or a zero-sum game. That is, you can circumstances, and there are plenty of projects, obviously not those supported by OPIC, but there are certainly many multinational projects which have been unmitigated, both as far as the host country is concerned and as far as the corporation is concerned. In between, we have those whereby one party can benefit at the expense of the other. Now, clearly the objective should be, in order to foster foreign investment, should be that it becomes a positive sum game. Now, there are some important characteristics which are necessary here, I think, in order to bring this about. One of them is that in order to benefit both parties, there must be a split in the gains, and it must be seen to be equally shared or shared in a balanced way between the various parties. Provide benefits to developing countries through, as Professor Franco said, the composite package. That is, the package of capital, foreign investment, and also the technology we provide, the management skills, and again, as emphasized, the markets. These are the advantages they bring, which there are also, however, some, and many tangible. But let me just quickly, there are, of course, the financial costs. Nowadays, countries are still concerned, despite the debt problem, countries are concerned about balance of payments costs, both in forms of payments of profits and dividends and so on. but also in terms of the effects of multinational corporations directly on the balance of payments. The cases of the NICD, where the multinationals have certainly served to increase the exports of a limited number of different countries. But on the other hand, it's generally recognized that multinationals have a higher import propensity, for example. They tend to import than domestic firms. This is a concern and is one of the reasons why, as Professor Franco said, some developing countries government to impose those export requirements. There are very costs in terms of balance of payments in that sense, and also through transfer pricing. This is a delicate balance of payments constrained by developing countries, a major concern. The second concern is the extent to which multinationals do in fact transfer technology and whether they retain and control it without passing on indigenous capability within the country. This is a concern not only about developing countries, but some large developed countries have also looked at this problem. In a classic case will be the oil industry, where there has been concern expressed in countries such as Canada, where the oil industry has recently been expanded, and in the UK, in Norway, have explicitly taken measures to the sector is not controlled, that their sovereignty, as it were, was not lost power of the multinationals. So the technology is very important, and of course of particular significance to the developing country. A few classic cases, if you like. The pharmaceutical industry is one where I think either India or, no, not India now, but in Pakistan, pharmaceutical companies transfer any technology in any effective sense to the country, and they merely use it as a packaging concern. So this is, again, a concern of developing countries. Another, and I agree that it's very difficult to test anybody's economics, cost-benefit, social cost-benefit analysis skills. Other costs are in the social and cultural and environmental area. Obviously, one case that will come up here, and I think discussed tomorrow, the environmental cost profile will be mentioned. But there are other less tangible, if you like, in the social and cultural area. The problems of, for example, exploitation of low-cost labour, the extent to which multinationalise or Americanise or Europe and lose their own culture. So therefore, while we've had quite a lot devoted to the benefits, there are also some costs. Not all of these are immediately translated into financial terms, and make the judgment, again, about going back to the original politics of national sovereignty, very difficult to. I'd just like to, another overall point about the role of foreign investment development process. Some cases have been cited of the effect that foreign investment can have. The fact of the matter is, however, the reality in the world today, investment from flows, the flow from the developed to the developing countries, highly concentrated on 50 countries, developing for 90% of the investment that comes from the developed world. The other 120 or so receive almost no foreign investment. Moreover, they're not likely to receive significant flows of foreign investment. They cannot to foreign investment of development. This question, I would argue, is put forward sometimes that we should reduce foreign aid flows, for example, and rely to a far greater extent on foreign direct investment. Foreign direct investment has 50% or in some years of the total capital of developing countries. It's unlikely that this is going to increase to any real extent and carry this burden of transfer of resources. I see I'm going to run out of time. You want me to touch upon the code? Yes. Just to develop this last point a bit further, in fact, in the economic conditions that we face, the evidence, I think, is that the flow of foreign direct investment is right now declining. And I think this points again to the difference between foreign investment and conditions. It's not only that we know how bank lending goes on, but this has in fact created a higher degree of uncertainty in the face. If you take large Latin American countries, a tremendous debt repayment, be very doubtful about investing in those countries when their economic prospects are so very uncertain, as they are with this horrendous debt problem. There's a relationship here between the debt and the overall flow of foreign direct investment. Foreign direct investment is not going to take up the slack of the other two variables, that is, which is becoming apparent. So I don't think in terms we can look to foreign investment as an engine of growth in the future in the developed countries. We have talked about environment and the thing need to stimulate foreign investment, and also the investors, the managers of the big corporations, and indeed of the small corporations, which are, I think, more important as investors. And what it is they most need to stimulate investment flows to developing countries. They would argue that stability is probably as important as anything else. They want what they call a stable investment in the very broadest sense of the word. Now, in order to countries, on the other hand, do not want to provide conditional guarantees, quite clearly, that under any circumstance certain things to corporations. They want, to go to the point, some share benefits, if you like. It has to be a positive. In order to produce such an environment where gains can be made and seen to be shared on a fairly equal footing, a number of arrangements have been proposed. Increasingly, countries are proposing bilateral, whereby they go to the hosting country and they say, will you treaty with us whereby you provide certainties to our companies operating in your country. These in turn, because in different situations today, they're strapped for cash, put it crudely, they're anxious to attract whatever capital they can, and quite frequently agree or feel obliged to agree on bilateral investment treaties. The difficulty we see with this is that these to be rather one-sided. Conditions on the developing country, without imposing any corresponding conditions, if you like, on the national corporations in those countries. They don't make any requirements corporations to meet the sort of concerns identified. For this reason, and here we've got a good solid UN hat, we in the UN firmly I think that's right.
Never firmly.
That there should be a multilateral form of set of rules for behaviour of multinational corporations as a whole. Now, there are a number of guidelines and rules. The developed countries have a set of rules amongst themselves. This obviously was not terribly difficult to agree upon, because the developed countries are most of the multinational corporations in the world. They have very distinct mutual interests in the companies in each other's countries. But there is that, it does not extend to the developing countries. Similarly, there are some, if you like, sectoral and international sets of rules. For example, there is one on infant or breast milk substitute, which has a particular problem in that area. National code covering what the multinationals can do in that area. Similarly, there is an international employment field, and there are others. The International Chamber of Commerce, very multinational corporation body, has, again, another set of rules, not a multilateral rules covering the general operations of multinationals. And this was in the idea that there should be a code was proposed in the UN in the mid-70s, and work started on making this code in around 19. At that time, again, the attitude towards multinationals was rather hostile. The code at that time was that it should impose conditions, if you like, on the way in which multinationals operated in host countries, whether they're developed countries or in countries. Again, it's a multilateral code. The passing of time and all negotiations, the developed countries argued for what they called a pact. They wanted the conditions to be imposed not only on the corporations, but also on the host government. That is, the way in which these governments treat multinational corporations. Obviously, key issues are those such as nationalisation. They didn't want, the developed countries did not want to have their multinationals nationalised by the government of Ruritania without compensation, and so on and so forth. So, the result of the negotiations, from what started at one hand as being essentially a code of conduct to regulate the multinationals, is now a two-sided, if you like. It sets out conditions and conditions for the treatment of the nationals by governments. This code is coming to its final stages, but has hit on some really major bottlenecks, which I should probably not elaborate upon. But I mention one thing, and I think it's rather unfortunate. Again, looking at the situation where the developing countries see themselves under very severe evidence. They fear they have already conceded quite a lot of negotiations on the code and are reluctant to concede a lot more. The developed countries, on the other hand, feel that there are some areas where they must push a lot harder, and the whole equation is by the fact that we have this increased tension between East and West. Is this relevant since there aren't any Eastern European multinational? Well, a few of the Western government, there are indeed a number of Eastern European multinational corporations, although these are very, very small, or they are actually limited, let me put it that way. Their overseas activities are very limited, but governments believe these activities should be included in a code of transnationals. The Eastern European governments, on the other hand, argue that their corporations, which are state-owned, do not operate according to rules as Western multinationals, and therefore be covered by the code. This, unfortunately, developing countries are concerned, a very sticking point, and I think it's unfortunate this East-West problem is involved in the whole increase in East-West tension these days. It should focus on a thing as really irrelevant to the East-West question and then on developing countries. I said very random.
Very random. Not random at all. Very, very good. Thank you. A very well-disciplined panel, but maybe a badly disciplined moderator. I think we've gone a little over the time that I had hoped we'd be able to be finished by. I am struck by some points that surfaced without our focusing directly on the implication of, and I hope that the panel will consider some of these as we questions. The issue of political sovereignty, of course, is not independent of the size of the country that we are talking about. Some of these multinational corporations have larger annual sales than the total GNP of the countries involved. To talk about the threat to national sovereignty to one of those countries, if a large-scale corporation wishes investment, is totally different than a company is negotiating with China or with Brazil or with any of the other countries. There's a learning process that has been going on that Ian Kimber talks about that is related to this. As countries learn what multinational corporations can bring to the bargaining table, and corporations learn what to in the development process, possibilities that you will mutually positive sum game get higher and higher. Certainly nobody wants to enter a negative sum game. But learning, too, has its economies of scale. It's much more difficult. If a country only has to learn these lessons once, it turns out that it's much more difficult for countries to learn these kinds of lessons, to gain of experience that they need in multinational corporations than do the larger countries, which accumulate this experience over a much broader spectrum. And so one of the hopes of the multilateral perspective, or even one of the hopes that the United States could, because it's the host to the largest number and the largest volume of multinational investments abroad, that perhaps the United States, in its own bilateral arrangements, would be able to bring to bear some of this experience and assistance. It was not lost on this end of the table. There were several references to Boston was going off to help either corporations or countries in the process, and it's not pleasing to see people sitting on opposite sides of the table from your same hometown in doing this. That learning process, however, seems to me to be a terribly important part of what we're talking about, and clearly reflects, I think, some of the differences in the climate and the attitudes now relative to 10 or 15 years ago. I was struck at our open seminar by the question that Paul Streeton put to the audience. Opening seminar on what is development. Professor Streeton asked a question that W. Arthur Lewis had asked at a conference several years ago. A thought question for you, and I want to put it to our panel in a slightly different form. Lewis's question was, would the developing countries be better off if the OECD countries suddenly below the ocean, never to reappear? Give your 20 or 30 or 40, 50 years for the adjustment to take place. Would the development prospects of the world be enhanced, or would they be dimmer if the rich countries of the world simply disappeared? The question I'd like to put to our panel is, would the development prospects of the third world be enhanced if we could somehow ban foreign direct investment? It's simply no longer legal to do that. That the multinational corporation would no longer be a vehicle in the process. Would that be a good thing on balance or a bad thing? I suspect I can predict the kinds of answers that we might get, because I don't think that it's an open and shut case either way. Paul Street was quite eloquent on at least the possibility that developing countries would be better off without rich countries around to underdevelop them, to use the dependencia term. And I certainly could at least frame of hypotheses that might lead to the same set of conclusions. I'd ask our panel, while you all are thinking of questions you'd like to put to them, I'd like our panel to contemplate the question. I'm going to ask Larry first because he's next to me.
Okay. You also probably sense I'm chomping at the bit on that one.
Yeah.
Also, if I may, not only your question, but may raise a slightly provocative issue before you moderate us into all sweetness and compromise.
Would I do?
But on your direct answer to your question, from my perspective, the experiment has been run. The experiment has been run in the People's Republic of China. The experiment has been run imperfectly in Eastern Europe. I say imperfectly because the Eastern Europeans have compensated for shutting out multinationals, foreign investment, by having an active policy of attempting to acquire technology by other means. Now, if the developed countries simply disappear and the world's storehouse of technological and managerial knowledge were to disappear with it, I think the answer is pretty clear that the developing countries would be much the worse for it. All the more so since there have been some rather remarkable, not too many, but there have been some rather remarkable advancements of lesser developed countries into at least the middle income. And in the case, you could argue in the case of Japan, Japan over at least a 50-year time period has made the breakthrough to developed country status. Indeed, much of Italy, you could argue, and much of Spain may be going through that transition process right now. I would argue the experiment has been run. The experiment was most neatly and clearly run during the People's Republic